Moving on then in Deleuze's logic of sense to the 8th series of structure. And in this chapter, it's a very brief one, but again, as with all of these chapters, it's also very dense. He begins with a paradox of Levi-Strauss, in which Levi-Strauss had said that for any two series that's given, there's always one series that is a signifying chain and the other series that is the signified chain. And the paradox is that the signifying chain always has an excess of signifiers over the signified chain, which always suffers from a basic lack. So there's always an asymmetry between them that never maps on directly. Language, for example, Deleuze says, has to be given all at once. All the differentiators within language, the differential relations between them, presuppose each other. And so language is, as it were, a totality that has to be given all at once as a signifying chain. But what we know now, the known, is the realm of the signified, what is already known, which is a progressive process of the unfolding of knowledge within a culture, and that's progressive, whereas the paradox is that the signifying chain of language has to be given all at once. And so there's a fundamental paradox there, in which there is then always an excess of signifiers and a lack of them. He says this could just as well be called the Robinson-Crusoe paradox, because excuse me, in order for Robinson Crusoe to reconstruct society, he has to assume and presuppose all at once all of its laws as a sum totality. But meanwhile, he is busy in the realm of his known world of signified, slowly conquering the island, slowly uncovering the known elements that will have to map onto the signifying chain, but won't precisely, because there are always more signifiers than there are signifieds to map onto them. And so this is the basic assumption of all law. Law always assumes a totality, regardless of whether it has the specified knowns or signifieds there to correspond to it or not. And so Deleuze says this is what makes all revolutions possible. And he says that revolutions happen as the result of the gap between the signifier and the signified. In a society, revolutions do not spring from technocracy, he says. Technocracy is part of the problem. Technocracy is in alliance with totalitarianism. Totalitarianism always assumes the sum totality of the knowns in a society. It always assumes the sum totality of the knowledge, and the technocrat is always on the side of the totalitarian, not the revolutionary. The revolutionary is always opposed to them. And, of course, Deleuze is always on the side of the revolutionary, as are all these great French thinkers. So then that brings us back to Levi-Strauss's paradox, in which we have the basic asymmetry between the signifying chain and the signified. And he says then that in the signifying chain there is a floating signifier, and the floating signifier within the signifying chain is what guarantees the production of culture, art, poetry, aesthetics, all the grand culture forms that come out of this floating signifier. But he says that in the signified chain, there is a floated signified that has been given to the signified by the signifying chain itself. And this floated signified is actually a kind of empty spot, or it's basically the excess in the signifying chain that is personified as a blank square. It's like the blank square in Scrabble, although it's not a direct analogy, because you can certainly play the Scrabble game without the blanks. You could remove the blanks and play it. But in the case that he's making here, he's saying that cosmologies are not possible without this excess of a non-specified or blank square that is part of the excess. It's basically a place without an occupant in the signifying chain, whereas in the signified, the signified suffers from a lack in the form of a supernumerary object without a place. It doesn't have a place. And because of this, this causes the asymmetry between the signifying chain and the signified to keep in constant operation. So there's always this blank thing that Levi-Strauss qualifies as the it, the gadget, the whatchamacallit, even mana, that which is non-specified in the signifying chain, but it's always there to be applied to the signified area that it will conquer. It occurs to me that in the art of the great artist Joseph Beuys, for example, this corresponds to the role played by fat in all of his works of art. He's always sculpting with fat, but fat for him was the principle of indeterminacy, that which has not yet received form in his works of art, that is always undergoing the process of transformation. The fat on the chair though it appears to be a nonsensical object, is of course not a nonsensical. There's actually, none of Joseph Beuys's installations were nonsensical whatsoever. All the signifieds are there. And in this case, the fat on the chair, what's important about it is the relationship between the fat and the right angle of the chair, which produces a triangular form that Beuys sees as a kind of metabolic structure that's in process of formation and disintegration simultaneously. But his art does not work without the fat, or something that corresponds to it, such as clay or honey, some kind of principle of indeterminacy that allows the system to function. And that floated signified that's given to the signified by the signifying chain is what Deleuze is after here. Now he says then that there have to be three minimal conditions for there to be a structure. One is that you don't have a structure without at least two heterogeneous series. You have to have two separate series in order for them to be a structure. That's condition number one. Condition number two is that within each of these series, there must be a series of events that give each series its history, and he calls these events, of course, singularities. Deleuze's whole cosmology is a cosmology of events and singularities. Singularities are novelties, ruptures with the status quo that turn up later in Alain Badiou as the event ontology that he derives more or less from Deleuze and transforms and adapts it to mathematical set theory. But in Deleuze, each system has its own history and has its own events, and these singularities have to be there in order for you to have a functioning structure. And the third condition in order to have a validly functioning structure is that the two series must eventually converge on a paradoxical element, which he calls the differentiator. And the differentiator is an element that doesn't belong to either one of the two systems because it constantly circles between the two systems and basically corresponds to the empty square. It's the empty square, that empty square in Scrabble. It's the empty square that ensures that there is always an excess of signifiers within the signifying system, always a space without an occupant, just as there's always a defect or a lack of signifiers, or rather a lack of signifieds in the signified chain, the chain of the signifieds, in which there's always an occupant without a place. And that's how the two systems work together and what sends them in a constant state of disequilibrium, that basic disequilibrium. It's a kind of thermodynamic, far from equilibrium state that enables the process of meaning to continually take place, since the mapping of the signifying chain never does correspond to the territory that is known about. When a new population moves into a new land, let's say as the Spaniards did, bringing their signifying chain of Christianity across the water with them to the world known by the Native Americans that was already a world of knowledge and sum total of signifieds, there was a basic disequilibrium, and there had to be a reterritorialization and a recoding of the map such that all the signifieds that were already there had to be retranslated into the pre-given signifiers of the Christian cosmology. But if there are any if there's an excess there, a blank space, that blank space then becomes the new cosmology that fills that blank space. And later, of course, we get the superhero cosmology that comes up into that blank area, that unmapped zone in the conqueror's signifying chain that comes up from below and creates a whole new cosmology. So this is a short chapter, but it's a very important one on the laws and conditions of structure.